Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shtark Tank, the podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. Most of our episodes feature incredible role models, people who are navigating the balance between Torah and work with strength and clarity. But today, we're going back in time to talk about someone who is no longer with us, someone who lived over a century ago, yet whose story feels just as relevant today as it did then. This is the story of the Bahlabus who shocked the Netziv. Now, focusing on a historical figure isn't a new concept for Shtark Tank. In fact, if you haven't yet listened to our incredible series on the legacy of Rabbi Sacks, I highly recommend it. But today's episode is unique for another reason. For the first time, this is not an interview. There's no back and forth discussion. It's just me sharing a story that had a deep impact on my own life. This story comes from the fourth volume of Makor Baruch, the historical memoir written by Rav Baruch Epstein, the esteemed author of Torah Tamima, Tosefes Bracha, Baruch Sha'amar, and many other Sfarim. Makor Baruch was written towards the end of his life, and the fourth volume, in particular, is devoted to his illustrious uncle, the Netziv, Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. Through its pages, we get a rare, intimate look at the Netziv's wisdom, his midos, and his unwavering commitment to Torah and his Talmidim. Some parts of this work were later translated into English under the title My Uncle the Netziv, a book that generated its fair share of controversy. Discussions about secular studies in Volozhin, women learning Gemara, even reading newspapers on Shabbos, these topics sparked plenty of debate. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Today, we're telling the story of one of the Netziv's top Talmidim, a young man who left yeshiva to become a Bahlabus. You will hear about the Netziv's advice for staying stark in the workforce, how this Talmud followed that advice, and Malava Malka that turned wild. I'm Yaakov Wolf, and this is Shtark Tank. In the 48th chapter of Makor Baruch, Rav Baruch Epstein recounts the story of a remarkable Talmud at Volozhin, one of the best and brightest in the legendary Beis Medrash. His name was spoken with admiration, his brilliance unquestioned. And yet, his path would take an unexpected turn, one that would leave the entire yeshiva world shaken. The climax came at a Malava Malka on Motzei Shabbos Parshas Beshalach. But before we reach that fateful night, we need to understand who this former Talmud was. Not only was he intellectually gifted, but he also earned the deep respect of the Netziv himself. The revered Rosh Yeshiva didn't just see him as another Eloi, prodigy among prodigies. He saw him as a future leader, a shining beacon of Torah. The Netziv took special pride in him, treating him as a prized disciple, a young man destined for greatness. His peers in the Beis Medrash would whisper about his sharpness, his breathtaking command of Torah. Some claimed he had an almost photographic memory, able to recall entire sugyas verbatim. Others said that he possessed a deep, intuitive grasp of lumdus, and he could learn an entire Masechta in a week. It was difficult to separate fact from legend, but one thing was certain: his name inspired awe. Everyone had high hopes. The trajectory seemed clear: a prestigious rabbinic post, likely in one of Europe's great cities. The Netziv even penned an effusive smicha, a glowing testament to his brilliance and potential. The entire yeshiva saw his future unfold before their eyes, one that would surely place him at the helm of Torah leadership. But man plans, and Hashem laughs. A series of unexpected, trying events led this promising young scholar into financial distress. He was still too young to secure a rabbinic position, yet he needed an income desperately. And so he made a decision that stunned the yeshiva world. He left Volozhin. The whispers began immediately. The young man who once filled the Beis Medrash with chiduchim was now going to be navigating ledgers and balance sheets. Instead of shach leviataria, his days would be filled with negotiations, investments, and financial strategies. Was he really giving up a potential stellar to become a bank teller? Leveraging his vast knowledge, his intellectual prowess extending beyond Torah to science, mathematics, and finance, He found a position as a banker in the city Pinsk. The news sent shockwaves through the Beis Medrash. How could such a mind, such potential, be redirected away from the halls of Torah study? How could a future Gadol b'Torah willingly step away? But in the Makor Baruch, Rav Epstein suggests that it was not just financial pressures that had driven him away. There was something else, something that gnawed at him, regardless of his financial struggles. He would say, I don't want to be a slave, but I also don't want to enslave others. The weight of responsibility, the limitations of the rabbinate, the constraints that would bind his life. He had a hard time bearing that thought. The image of being tethered to a community, answering to others, carrying the burden of leadership. It was not for him. Rav Baruch Epstein, in a footnote, shares another fascinating story that echoes this sentiment. A wealthy and distinguished Talmid Chacham was seeking a shidduch for his daughter. Two potential candidates stood before him. One was the son of a prominent Rav, though he himself was not particularly talented in his learning. The other was a serious Talmid Chacham, a true budding scholar with the potential to become a great rabbi in his own right. The father chose the son of the Rav. The community was baffled. Why overlook a budding gadol in favor of a boy whose primary yichus was through his father? His answer was simple yet profound. I don't want my daughter to be a rebbitzin. He had seen the weight, the pressure, the limitations that came with such a role. A rebbitzin's life, he believed, was too constrained, too defined by the burdens of her husband's position. Reb Epstein also loves finding Torah sources for all of these stories, and he does that here as well, but we're not going to get into that right now. Anyhow, a life of Torah was beautiful, but the rabbinic position came with a heavy price, and the young man from Volozhin had chosen to walk away. And so, at the end of the Zman, he packed his bags and prepared to leave. But first, he had to say goodbye to the Rosh Yeshiva. So, with his heart racing, he approached the Netziv's room and knocked on the door. The air was heavy with unspoken emotion. This was not just a farewell, it was a parting of ways that neither of them had ever imagined. The rabbinate, lamented the Netziv, has lost one of its finest. The Netziv continued, I know that the world outside has good and decent people, and I know that you will build a respectable life, both materially and spiritually. But there is a concept in halacha called hasagas gvul, infringing on another's boundaries. Most people understand this to mean that you cannot encroach on someone else's property, business, or livelihood. But there is another kind of hasagas gvul, one that is far more tragic, hasagas gvul atzmo, infringing on your own potential. The Talmud looked up, puzzled. Imagine, said the Netziv, that a man enrolls in a military academy and undergoes years of grueling training, excels at every level, and just as he's about to graduate as an officer, he quits. That is hasagas gvul atzmo, and that is a tragedy. The message was clear. The Talmud, shaken, started to apologize profusely. Rebbe, I have no choice. The financial burden is too great. The Netziv sighed. Apologies won't change the reality, but here's what you can do. Promise me that you will never stop learning, not just like a regular Bahlabus, but with real depth, as often as you can. The Talmud nodded, moved. I promise, he said. But the Netziv wasn't finished. Promise? In the business world, do you seal deals with just a promise? You need collateral, something that guarantees your commitment. The Talmud hesitated. Do you mean some royal banknotes? The Netziv smiled. I don't care about those. I want you to commit to writing. Whenever you learn something, bi'iyun, write it down in your clear and beautiful style. When you have gathered enough material, refine it, review it with Talmidei Chachamim, and publish it. That will be your collateral. The Talmud extended his hand. The Netziv grasped it warmly. The deal was sealed. Years later, on Motzei Shabbos Shira, the Volozhin Rosh Yeshiva hosted his festive Malava Malka. The room was filled with young B'nai Torah, the air thick with deep Torah conversations, wisdom, and warm camaraderie. I'm sure that the air outside in Volozhin in the winter was frigid, but inside, everyone was on fire. At the head of the table sat the Netziv, enjoying his traditional post-Shabbos meal, not noodles and cheese, but steaming cholent. Amid the crowd sat a familiar face, the former Talmud, now a baker, who had returned to Volozhin for a visit. As he sat among the scholars, A wave of nostalgia and longing washed over him. Just then, the door burst open. A rough, burly man stormed in, eyes locked on the Netziv. "I have a question," he declared. The room fell silent. The Netziv was used to dealing with all sorts of interesting people, and he was unshaken. He motioned for him to continue. The man, a butcher, explained that years ago he had a bitter dispute with another local butcher. In his rage, he swore a shavua never to lay eyes on him again. For years, he had gone to extreme lengths to keep his vow. If he was walking on the street and saw him from a distance, he would quickly turn around and take another route. He even went so far as to switch to a new shul in order to avoid running into his nemesis at Minyan. But that very day, his former rival had died. Now, with his anger faded and time having softened his grudge, he wished to ask forgiveness before the Levaya. He didn't want the other butcher taking this fight to the grave. But his shavua, did it still bind him? Could he stand near the coffin and ask mechila, or would that constitute breaking his oath? Asking mechila post-mortem is a whole nother sugya, and we're not going to get into it right now. But the butcher wanted to know, is his shvua binding, or is he allowed to go and ask mechila? A fierce debate erupted among the Talmidim. Some argued that the shavua was absolute. He had sworn never to see the man, and even in death, seeing his body might be considered a violation. Others countered that death changed the equation, and it was not adata dahachi. Maybe seeing a lifeless body was not the same as seeing a living person. Under those circumstances, the Talmidim argued, one could perform a hatara shavua and allowing this butcher to cancel his original oath. As the debate raged, the Netziv added another layer. He said that in such a case as this one, you could maybe be machmir and tell the butcher to just not go. But what would be in a case of an aguna, that the only person who's able to identify the dead body of a husband had taken a similar shvua? You could take the same question and make it a lot more interesting and a lot more loaded. The arguments grew more passionate, voices overlapping, hands gesturing wildly as different mafarshim were cited. Then, suddenly, the banker, the former Talmud, spoke up for the first time that evening. His voice, steady and confident, cut through the noise. "There's no need for Hataras Nadarim or any other Hatara," he said. "The answer is right there, in the words of the Parsha that we read this morning." A hush fell over the room. The Talmidim turned to him, puzzled. The Netziv arched an eyebrow, intrigued. He continued, "Hashem told Bnei Israel, Asher ri'isem es Mitzrayim hayom, lo tosifu lirosam od ad olam. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." And yet, what does the next pasuk say? Vayar Yisrael es Mitzrayim, meis al sfas hayam. And Bnei Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea. The room was silent. The banker leaned forward. It's clear from the psukim that seeing a dead person does not count as seeing them in the same way. If Hashem's promise that the Egyptians would never be seen again was still fulfilled, even though Bnei Israel saw their lifeless bodies, then surely this butcher's shavua does not apply to seeing his former rival in depth. The Netziv jumped up in excitement, knocking his bowl of steaming challah, sending it teetering towards the end of the table, where an alert Talmud made a clutch save. His face lit up, his hands clapping together. "This is a precious diamond," he exclaimed. "What a blessing to be able to uncover these Torah treasures." The room erupted. Some of the Talmidim could barely contain their excitement. I could imagine themselves holding each other back, like college basketball players celebrating on the bench of a March Madness thriller. The intensity of the back and forth was electric. But remember, these are yeshiva guys. One young Eloi stood up, loading up for a bomb kasha. Perhaps, he argued, the Jews only saw the Egyptians from a distance, a vague blur of bodies on the shore. That's not comparable to standing near a coffin. The Netziv countered. When Hashem declared that Bnei Yisrael would never see the Egyptians again, it was an absolute statement. You can't make such a distinction. The former Talmud, the banker, leaned forward again. And even more so, Chazal tell us that the Jewish people could identify which specific Egyptian had tormented them in slavery. That means that they saw them at close range. Another hush fell over the room. This wasn't just an impressive response, it was airtight. Even the most brilliant students sat stunned. The Netziv nodded, his face glowing with pride. He turned to the butcher and delivered his final psak. You may go and ask Mechila. Your Shavua no longer binds you. The butcher, still overwhelmed by the sheer depth of Torah discussion that had arisen from his simple question, bowed his head and left, visibly relieved. Then the Netziv turned back to the banker, his eyes twinkling with admiration. If these are the chidushim you produce while working in the world of business, he said with a mischievous smile, halavai, that I should be like you. The room burst into laughter and cheers. But beneath the humor was something deeper, a recognition that Torah was not confined to the walls of yeshiva. It could live, breathe, and even flourish wherever one was committed to it. And what became of the collateral that the Talmud and the Netziv agreed upon? The Talmud kept his promise. Despite the demands of his profession, he remained deeply engaged in Torah learning, meticulously writing down his insights, refining them, and preparing them for publication. He upheld his commitment to the Netziv, ensuring that his Torah study was not merely a private pursuit, but something that would enrich the broader Torah world. Over the years, his writings grew in scope and depth, eventually culminating in a monumental work. When he presented the first volume to the Netziv, it was a moment of profound significance. The Netziv, whose beloved Volozhin yeshiva had been shuttered by government decree, saw in this sefer a flicker of light amid the darkness. This, he said, holding the newly published sefer in his hands, is a beacon of Torah in difficult times. May Klal Yisrael merit more Talmidei Chachamim like you. At the end of the chapter in Makor Baruch, Rav Baruch Epstein shares one last detail. Who was this Talmud whose career as a banker didn't prevent him from being a prolific Mechaber Sfarim? Rav Baruch Epstein writes, that guy, it was me. I was the Talmud who became a banker. I was the one who felt the Netziv's piercing glare during that final shmooze. I was the one who kept my promise, continuing to learn deeply and write down and publicize my chidushim. His most famous set of Sfarim was the Torah Tamima. This sefer, a masterful commentary that connects Chumash with the words of Chazal, became a fundamental text for Torah learners worldwide. It was not merely an intellectual achievement, it was the embodiment of a promise, a testament to his unwavering dedication to Torah, despite the challenges of the working world. And so, the legacy of that young Talmud, Rav Baruch Epstein, lives on. His words studied by thousands, his insights illuminating the connection between the written and oral Torah. His journey was unconventional, but through perseverance and faithfulness to his commitment, he proved that one can remain deeply connected to Torah no matter the path life takes. This story resonates with me for many reasons. The emotions of leaving yeshiva are deeply familiar to many of the listeners of this podcast. The expectation that a strong Ben Torah will naturally enter Klei Kodesh without question still persists. I've experienced it firsthand. People from Keren B'Yavneh, or those who knew that I learned there, often assume that I must be doing something rabbinic. So, where are you teaching these days? They ask. You moved down to the Negev because they were looking for a Rav? They questioned me earnestly. But there's another dimension, the role of writing. The Netziv encouraged his nephew to use writing as a means of deepening his learning, a way of persevering and clarifying his Torah thoughts. The Torah Tamima is not the only recent Gadol who was both a professional and a Machaber Sfarim. Another great example is the Chai Adam, Rav Avraham Danzig. He wrote the Chai Adam on Orach Chaim and the Chachmas Adam on Yoredeah. Both are fundamental works and have received widespread acceptance in the world of Psak Halacha. And he describes his career as a merchant in the introduction to the Chachmas Adam. And he writes as follows: V'ya'idu alai hasochrim, she'afilu be'et nesiati beLeipzig, lo manati likach imi Gemara u'Mikra u'Mishna, ve'afilu b'shas Yerid, kim'at shelamanti b'kol yom daf v'chetzi Gemara. The other merchants will testify that even during the busiest time that I was traveling to Leipzig, I would not prevent myself from bringing my Gemara, my Chumash, and my Mishnayos. And even during the times of the fair itself, I learned daily, almost a daf and a half of Gemara every single day. He continues, "V'chaye roshi, she'ein ani kotev zos lihizgaos ulehispire." God forbid that I should write this in order to glorify myself or to raise myself up. Kimani umachayai v'Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai omer im lamad Torah harbe al tachzik tov la'atzmecha ki lakach notzarta v'kol shkein im yolmod ma'at ma'at asher kol echad mechuyav b'zeh. And so he brings a kal v'chomer. If Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says that you can't be machzik tov la'atzmecha, you can't assume any greatness for learning a lot of Torah. So kal v'chomer, me, who's learning only a little bit. V'chiyesh hisparus shemeniach tefillin b'kol yom. Is there anyone who can show off that they put on tefillin every day? Chach achiv lilmod b'chol yom. Similarly, a person is obligated to learn Torah every day. K'dechsev u'lechtecha b'derech. Even when you're traveling, you're obligated to learn Torah. So just like a person is not going to beat on his chest and show off that he put on tefillin in the morning, so too, the fact that I'm writing about my learning regimen is not to show off in any way, shape, and form. V'ani kotev ze rak leida v'lehodia. Shetoim ma'od hasochrim shehem ala derech. The only reason why I'm writing this is to remind all the other businessmen, all the other merchants, that they are mistaken. Shehem ala derech ubeprat b'shas yirid omrim b'derech halatza kiven shenase pater min hamitzvos. They jokingly say that because they're traveling and they're so busy, they must be pater min hamitzvos. Chalila lo zeu derech haTorah. Kimama Rabbi Tarfon, v'yata ben chorin li pater mimena. Chas v'shalom, we have a chiyuv to learn Torah even when we're traveling for business. V'chiyuv zeh hu b'chol eis v'zman, ki dechtiv b'shivtcha b'yisecha, u'b'lechtcha v'derech. V'ulai mimeni yilmedu, banai, v'yotzei cholatzai, im afilu echad mi'elef, v'yele l'zchos k'tzas. And I hope that maybe at least some of my children or some of my offspring, 1 in 1,000, will internalize this message, and I will have a little bit of zchus. That's why I'm sharing this. That even though I, writes the Chai Adam, am so busy traveling for my business dealings, I still make sure to continue my learning. And he was able to continue learning at such a high level that he wrote these tremendous Sifrei Halacha that were accepted among large swaths of Klal Yisrael. On the Shtark Tank podcast, we've also spoken with many people who are living amongst us who have followed a similar path, using writing to refine and share their Torah. In our very first episode, we spoke with Zevi Reinitz, who, despite being a very busy marketing executive, finds a way to publish new Sfarim for every family simcha. He was inspired by Dr. Applebaum, Hashem Yikom Demo, the founder of Tarim Emergency Medical Centers, who had a very similar minhag. We also spoke to Michael Eisenberg, one of Israel's prominent venture capitalists, who wakes up early in the morning to write Divrei Torah about how modern economic ideas blend with ancient Torah texts. Those essays have turned into many, many Sfarim that are available in both Hebrew and English. I also loved hearing Zivi Mendelson, who runs an importing business. He described photocopying Mara Makomos to take with him on long flights to China and writing notes on hotel stationery all across the world. These ideas ended up becoming a 500-page sefer, and since our conversation over a year ago, he has published a second volume of Malayim Ziv. These individuals have had a big impact on me personally. In the months since leaving yeshiva, I have found this to be the most crucial component of my own learning. While I often wish I had more time to write, it is precisely this process of writing that has given me motivation, joy, and a profound sense of accomplishment in Torah. It's also very special to know that a number of the listeners and members of our broader Shtark Tank community are also writing alongside their professional pursuits. There was even one listener, Izzy Muller, who was inspired by our very first episode to put out his own kuntras at the Pidyon Haben of his firstborn son. Other listeners have also reached out, sharing their writings and their publications that they're working on, and all of these are very, very impressive. May we all be zoche to use our talents in the Beis Medrash and beyond to strengthen our connection to Torah and inspire others along the way. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy Shtark Tank, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review and share your favorite episode with a few friends. Until next time, keep on steiging, Chevra.